We all need to make smart decisions with our money. The Long-Term Investor Podcast shows you how by distilling complex financial matters into easily digestible lessons. And now, here's your host, Chief Investment Officer at PlanCorp and the author of Making Money Simple, Peter Lazaroff.
Welcome to the Long-Term Investor. Today with me is Roger Whitney, host of the retirement podcast, Retirement Answer Man, which is one of the top retirement podcasts in iTunes with more than 4 million downloads and counting. He is also the author of Rock Retirement, a simple guide to help you take control and be more optimistic about the future. And Roger's also been ranked by Investopedia as one of the top 100 most influential advisors in each of the past 5 years. I've known Roger for a long time personally, and you can see in his bio, he's worked for 25 years, more than 25 years at this point, with individuals on that transition into retirement. So I'm hoping today he's going to help our listeners pick up on a few secrets of how to rock retirement. Roger, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, once you get to 25 years, you just say more than. You don't want to keep counting after that. It's great to be here, Peter. I'm excited for your show.
Well, your show is wonderful. I've always been appreciative of when I join you as a guest. And I always find that your take on retirement planning, as well as living retirement, is so refreshing and something that I hope a lot of people can learn from. When you think of those who are retiring today, they're largely baby boomers, right? And they really aren't retiring the way that their parents did. I think you talk a lot about how those differences manifest themselves. Maybe we can start there.
Well, I frame it in a traditional retiree. The image that we had, and you don't see it as much anymore, was sitting on the park bench of life. I mean, retirement, even the etymology of the word is, to take away from usefulness. And the older retiree really focused on sitting on the park bench and watching life and just finally having a chance to rest, right? And the modern retiree is very different than that, right? It's really their chance to go play in the playground now that they have time freedom after leaving full-time work. It's their chance to explore and play and do things, which is very different than past generations. And then in other ways that it's different is they're going to live longer than any other generation in history. They're actually going to be healthier and more active than any other generation in history. And most of them aren't going to have a pension. So it's a very different planning dynamic than what a lot of financial planning was originally designed for. And I think it's important to understand that so we can figure out what the heck we do about it.
Well, and it seems like traditional financial retirement planning was all about coming up with this magic number that allows you to be okay. If you have this pot of money, retirement is fine. And to your point, we have to take more control of our retirement planning ourselves. A lot of people don't have pensions anymore. But I find in our roles as advisors is it's not just about that magic number. It's what are you even going to do with yourself once you retire?
Yeah, there's a lot beyond the financial numbers that has to be explored. If you're going to live roughly a third of your life not working or having a lot of time freedom, that's a lot. My grandfather didn't have to figure out what he was going to do every day when he retired from the post office. He knew he was going to move to Florida and read books and not walk, because that's what he did for a living. But the modern retiree is going to have to figure out who they're going to be when they grow up, what their new identity is going to be, etc. And I think that's really important. And you talk about the traditional retirement planning. We can decide whether we want to get into this, Peter. It tries to boil a life down to a simple math problem that can actually be figured out. Partly because the process was designed by investment managers, financial planners, insurance agents, people that loved all the geeky numbers and they were comfortable there. And partly because everything is focused on investments or products as the hub of the process. It always comes back to those things. And I think what has happened when you pair that with a modern retiree, it's not the best match because our message to individuals ends up being, trust the long-term numbers. It's going to be okay. Trust me. Which takes away one thing that people really need when they're facing this big life change, which is hope. I've been really interested in this word hope recently, Peter. Of when you're retiring, say at 60, and you're looking forward to 30 years with no pension, and you see these long-term models and we see all the uncertainty that's going on in the world, it's hard to have hope. And if you have a process that just says, hey, just trust these numbers, it'll work out, that's not very empowering. And do you know what you need for hope, Peter?
What is that?
You need three things. You need to have an inspiring goal about a future state for yourself, right? And I think a lot of retirees are forming that. They're excited about retirement. But the other thing you need to have hope is you need to have agency. You need to have some confidence that you can act to make that inspiring goal true. And our planning process doesn't give people a lot of agency. It just says, just trust us, it'll work. And then lastly, you need pathways. You need some pathway of things you can do to exercise your agency to make the inspiring goal happen or occur. And I think our planning process doesn't really help people do that as well as it could.
I really like that focus on hope in those three things. And you mentioned that life is more than a math problem. And I find myself telling people all the time that you don't live in a spreadsheet. And the math answer isn't always going to be the right answer for the end client or for any given person. And I think you are also trying to balance this trade-off between your current life, because you want to enjoy the journey as much as the destination, as well as setting yourself up so that when you reach your destination, you're not just eating crackers and peanut butter all the time, unless that's your favorite meal, in which case, by all means. So many things that you talk about that I am tempted to go down the path, but let me circle back a little bit further to kind of rethinking the retirement factor, the defining who you're going to be in retirement. How are some of the ways that you are coaching those both in your Rock Retirement Club, which we'll talk about a little bit, and through the podcast and through your own practice in designing a life, both that they can enjoy in the current period as well as in that end goal destination?
Well, I think, and this is a really good topic because we hear a lot about of the things we should be doing to create a retirement, all these action items that we should be doing, these tasks around the financial and the non-financial. I don't think we spend near as much time talking about how do we actually go about doing it. What is the method that we go and deal with these things? So what I think, Peter, is that rather than try to figure it all out at once, what do you want for the rest of your life? I mean, could you answer that, Peter, honestly?
No. And I try hard to plan out 15 years in advance. And that even feels like a stretch. I know that's unusual to do that, but beyond 15 years, the world is going to look so different. Every 10 years, the world looks drastically different. So it is difficult to picture where we'll be that far out.
And the other thing that looks difficult that I think we agree, the outside world is going to be different, and we have no idea how. We read things, but I think the thing that we don't acknowledge as much is, Peter, you're not going to be the same Peter 15 years from now or 10 or 15 years from now, are you? You'll be a version of yourself. And I've been married 31 years, and I always say, it's like, my wife has been married to like 4 different men over those 31 years. I mean, I'm a version of who I am, but I evolve and I'm different, and she has as well. And so when you're planning for retirement, whether it's financially or on the personal level, rather than try to figure all this stuff out in some deterministic way, I think it's much more helpful to build a structure to manage all that uncertainty so you can have lots of little conversations to reassess, adjust, and then figure out what you want to do next. And that, I think, is true financially, but it's also true on what you're going to do every day, what your identity is going to be, what your purpose is going to be. All those things are going to change. And so rather than sitting down and thinking you have to figure out your purpose statement for the rest of your life, have a working draft that's a living document that you just keep adjusting. So I like processes that are focused on how do you have those little conversations so you can just iterate and adjust as life unfolds. I think that's a healthier way, because if you talk to somebody that is getting ready to retire, say, what's your identity going to be when you retire? Well, their identity is probably district salesperson, executive vice president. That's probably the identity they use. They don't know what their identity is going to be. And to just push that on them to figure out all at once and create a statement isn't really helpful. One, it's not helpful because they're institutionalized. Someone that's been working in a career for decades, they're like a prisoner in Shawshank. They don't know what it's like on the outside, right? It's just conceptual. They sort of have to get to the outside and start to figure out what their identity is. And that's what the kind of process you want to manage more than forcing them to figure it out all at once when they have no concept of what it really even means.
That's so interesting that you talk about embracing the uncertainty of your personal life. As someone who's focused a lot on the asset allocation for our clients, I'm always talking about uncertainty of the world and market events. But you're right, there is such great uncertainty of your personal life, and that requires a lot of flexibility. You have branded your financial process as agile financial planning, which I really love. I think it really embraces what the modern advisor in many cases is doing, but is not by all means universal at this point. And I think accepting uncertainty as a very healthy part of this equation is a really important piece of that. So, I mean, maybe you've already kind of covered this, and I actually believe that's one of the principles of your agile process. Maybe you could walk us through some of the principles of what you feel is an agile financial planning process.
Yeah, and a lot of this is borrowed from the agile project methodology that software is developed with. Well, let's talk about uncertainty, is to accept uncertainty. And the way you phrased it is we think so much about markets and economies and everything else is that, and those things are fundamentally unknowable and uncontrollable. So the foundation of an agile process is how do we control the controllable and not spend too much time noodling on things that we actually can't control: markets, economy, interest rates. And so it always comes back to, one, accepting uncertainty. Sure, we have to have long-term assumptions, but let's not get overly obsessed with the assumptions or what's going to zig and zag, because we can't know that. And it is going to distract us from spending time on things that we can do. So accepting uncertainty. Collaboration is a big component of an agile process in the sense that, I work as a retirement planner, so I'll speak from this perspective. What I bring to the table as, say, the project manager is the framework and what we should do and when, because I've walked this journey so many times. And rather than have a client come to me and give me all their stuff and me just tell them what to do, which is sort of a delegation, what I think is more helpful is the client comes with, their life. They know their life better than anybody else. And this is what it's all about, their life. And they have other skills as well. So in collaborating, let's say from an advisor-client relationship, it's much healthier for us to think through how do we do this together than it is for me to tell them what to do or for them to drive it. So collaboration gets to better results. And then lots of communication. And so those are some of the things that are encompassed in more of an agile approach.
In that collaboration strikes me as a piece where and I'm blanking on the author in the book, maybe it's Robert Cialdini, and maybe the book is Influence. And if not, it's something close to that, where it talks about if you're trying to get someone to take the right action or take your point of view, it's better for it to be their idea in some sense. And I find, at least when picking a portfolio, for example, someone might choose an index portfolio, some might choose an ESG portfolio. Some might want to do factor investing where they have higher returns, or at least higher expected returns. But if I tell you which one is optimal and you don't believe me, then you're going to bail when it matters. And similarly, if you're going to follow a financial planning process that could by no means predict whatever random set of events unfold in the next 2 months or 2 years or 2 decades, it all falls apart if you don't believe in it also. So I really do love the collaboration piece in so many different ways. And I think for advisors, you used to just be selling products, whereas now you really are coaching. You've said that walking side by side with your clients is more so than using a bunch of jargon and throwing a bunch of numbers out there and saying, see, this is what the data says, so let's do it. I think you have to help people arrive at the solution and understand. You mentioned communication is key. Understand the why we're doing something so that when it looks like it's all falling apart, if you understand that reasoning, you can stay the course.
You hit it right on the head, Peter. It doesn't matter how many facts are behind you. Just saying, here's all the models, here's how it looks. And this could be whether you're doing it on your own with software or working with a planner. We've input all the data. You will be okay. Don't worry. That's just faith. That's not hope. And I think having ownership of a plan and having some confidence that you have a system to be able to make little adjustments along the way helps you get that agency and gives you a pathway. So I always tell people a story, Peter, when it comes to retirement, because retirement is about outcomes. It's about life outcomes. It's not about optimizing money. It's about optimizing life, right? And the story I tell people, and generally I'm dealing with people that don't see this as a possible outcome for them. And what I tell them at the beginning is, hey, look, we can do everything right in managing life as it unfolds and looking for risks and opportunities and making little adjustments along the way. But at the end of the day, you may have to live in a trailer, even if we do everything right, because the future is unknowable. If we had the perfect storm of life events, life shocks, inflation, bad investments, bad investment return sequences, higher taxes, on and on and on and on. There's only so much you can lean into the wind, regardless of how much agency you have. And we can't figure all this out. And I know that's really scary. But what we can do is, if we have a process where we're constantly reassessing what is important to us and what are the resources we have and what are risks and opportunities we can take little baby actions on and make lots of little adjustments along the way, even if everything goes wrong, we're going to be mitigating and making the most of life as we iterate to whatever that end is. That's the best that we got. That's sort of what life is. And so the key is controlling those controllables and not spending so much time focused on things outside of your control.
And I always think when I'm speaking to another advisor, especially somebody like you, of the compass, and how if you do those small course corrections so that the compass is pointing in the right direction, over time you end up where you're trying to go. If you only checked your compass or you only checked in with a guide once every few years, there's a real good chance that you'll end up somewhere else, which isn't always going to be bad, but it's not always what you intended. I guess the other part of that, though, is that there has to be some flexibility somewhere. So if I'm pointing a compass somewhere and I have to somehow leap over a 1-mile canyon, I can't do that. So where does flexibility come into play in your mind, Roger?
Well, that's a great metaphor for what we're talking about. You know, if you're orienteering, you're setting, that is where I want to go, and this is the pathway to get there, and here's my agency to start walking that pathway. Well, as soon as you take a step, everything changes, right? You're on this pathway, and all of a sudden you hurt your ankle. Well, maybe you need to find a different path because you can't take the direct journey. You have to take a journey that fits what you're capable of doing. Or perhaps you run into the canyon and then you have to readjust as life unfolds. The key is you want to identify those, Peter, as early as you can. Is this still where I want to go? You know, the classic story of that is a husband and wife that are getting ready to retire, and they're saying, this is our forever home. We're going to live in this house. And that's what the plan is based off of, right? And they marshal all their resources to age in place in their home. And they get to retirement and they have the conversation. One of the spouses says, well, wait a second. No, I don't want this. My grandbabies are over there. They live 3 states away and I want to be local to them. But nobody ever addressed that. Everybody thought they were going to age in place. And all of a sudden one partner is, I've set this up, my atmosphere for how I want my life to be. And the other one was living a separate life of being 3 states away where the grandbabies are. And now that's a big conversation. So like the orienteering example, you don't want to not check in on, is this what we want? What can we do to marshal our resources by having those little conversations about what we want, what our resources, how they're allocated, what are risks and opportunities that we can take advantage of or mitigate. That has to be a very agile process. And what I think most of the time happens is we have a deterministic process, whether it's with a planner or on your own, and we don't check in near as much as we should to poke around to make sure we don't have a canyon in front of us.
Well, and the example you give highlights how, while money is important, it is a tool that lets us do these things. It is not the only factor in having a great retirement. Your health, your relationships, whatever your purpose is going to be, those are things that are maybe going to have an outsized impact as opposed to the number on your statements. You don't want to ignore them. How should people who have been so focused on getting to their magic number or replacing X amount of monthly income, what are some exercises that people can do to better identify some of these other factors that will really give them a more fulfilling retirement?
I think one of the best things that people can do is start to look at their life with fresh eyes. The problem is when you get to retirement, assuming you did a lot of the things right, is you're like a bodybuilder that has a huge upper body but never worked their legs. In the sense that when you get to retirement, you have these overdeveloped muscles of denying yourself, embracing investment risk, and saving for the future and seeing your assets grow. And then being able to look in the mirror of your net worth statement and get that rush of it went from X to Y or whatever. And so you're a really good saver and you're a really good accumulator. And then when you get to retirement, everything changes. You lose your superpower of being able to earn income. That's scary. That's agency. You want to talk about losing agency, go from, king of the world income-wise to having none. That means you're not saving. So you're not seeing your net worth go up just from your contributions. Well, talk about losing agency and scary. Oh yeah. And you're supposed to start spending this money. And so I think the first thing you can do is start to really embrace the fact that my spending muscles, my legs aren't very well developed. And I can't just keep focused on accumulating or having that mindset, because what will end up happening is, and I see this all the time, is you'll focus on continuing to deny yourself, partly because you're worried about, having the crackers and peanut butter when you're 90. And then you'll get to an age when you're 80 or so, and you're going to realize, oh crap, I'm going to have way more money than I need. And as soon as you have that thought, the second thought's going to be, man, what could I have done? Sure, I can do stuff now, but the grandkids are grown. Everybody's spread out. I don't have near as much energy. And you're going to look back at your 60s and 70s and say, what could I have done? And so I think we need to understand this so we can develop and start to overcome some of our frugality, because this is what the money was meant for.
Well, and I think a lot of that still goes back to having that balance between enjoying the journey on the point to retirement so that you can have a retirement where you don't feel like you have these underdeveloped legs, as you reference. And your podcast, I think, really does a nice job of balancing ways that you in your own life are enjoying yourself and the things in your hopes and dreams. I think you're very open and personable with sort of how you think about your existing path. But then you also have this Rock Retirement Club that has a lot of people seeking to maximize the fulfillment of their life. Maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit about the genesis of Rock Retirement and what it's doing now.
Yeah, so the Rock Retirement Club came out of the fact that for the last year and a half or so, we haven't been accepting new clients. I said I wasn't for a while, and I was, and then we stopped it cold. And a lot of people need help. And also because we have the show and it's been around for 8 years or so, there's a lot of people that are more than capable doing this on their own, and they want to do it on their own, or they want to learn how to be a better client and partner with their advisor. And when I looked out there, I learned from people telling me is that there's really no place to get world-class education on how do you actually do retirement from a financial and non-financial perspective world-class education that's not actually trying to sell you anything after it, right? There's a lot of information out there, but it's always tied to some offer or some funnel. So what we thought we'd do is we create a club, which is a safe place where there's no selling, no marketing, no anything, and then create world-class education on how do you actually do retirement, not theory, but how do you actually do it and where do you start? Like the yellow brick road. What's the first brick I start on and how do I walk the path from the beginning to where it is? So you can actually make these little decisions. And then, so we have the world-class education. We have the tools to make it so. And then we have this community of over 800 people. And this is the part that surprised me the most, I guess, is we have 800 people that all have the same positive mindset, that are very balanced in focusing on being good stewards of the money, but also being good stewards of their life. And they're sharing their journeys for everybody to help each other. But it came from, there was this gap where people couldn't get world-class education or have adult conversations without it, devolving into, what happens on the internet. So that's where the club came from.
That very last part's so interesting. What you see on the internet, and we're all trained to think of retirement in a certain way, and having some like-minded people in a safe place to talk about what's otherwise a taboo topic of money, but maybe a less taboo topic of retirement, which is so personal and different to each and every person and is going to mean a different thing to each and every person. When I read through your materials like the Rock Retirement book, or when I'm listening to the Retirement Answer Man podcast, I hear a lot of these messages that you're talking about today sort of shine through. But I'm curious, as you've evolved, we've heard that your wife has been married to 4 versions of Roger now, roughly 4.3 versions or something like that. If I were going to point my listeners to some books that you felt like have really influenced your way of thinking through these things, your viewpoint on these things, what are some books or resources, shows, anything that you could point others to?
Well, there are so many, but I think the one that hits to the core of what we've been talking about, hits to the core of, I think, how traditional planning does, whether you're doing it on your own or working with an advisor. The difficulty with retirement is it's about life outcomes. And because there's so much financial uncertainty, and rightly so, there is. We don't know when people are going to die. We don't know what events are going to happen. Everything is designed to make sure that we're okay when we're 90, which is important. But it can be imbalanced and we can forget about today. And we can get to that point where there are regrets. So probably the number one book for this context, let me grab it here, is The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying by Bronnie Ware. When you're accumulating assets, you're sowing. In retirement, you're supposed to be reaping. Using all of this deferred income and whatever growth you were able to get to create the kind of life that you want now that you aren't earning the income. That's the point. And I am a big believer in regret minimalization. I'm less of a big goal setter far out, but I am very focused on avoiding the top regrets. So when I look back at the end of life, I can go, heck yeah, that was awesome, as much as I can. So let me read you the top 5 regrets, and it's a great book. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself. Number 2 is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Number 3 is, I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. Number 4 is, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And number 5, I wish I had let myself be happier. So I think our job in life in general, but in retirement especially, because we have the resources and we have the time freedom, is how do we minimize these regrets? And that has to do with money, but it also has to do with making sure that we know our identity, we have a purpose, and we're living a life true to ourselves, not based off of what the corporation wants or what I have to provide for all these other people in my life. But this is your chance to have a clean slate to really create a life that you can look back on and say, yeah, I made a difference and that was for me. And I minimized these regrets as much as I could. So that'd be the top book, because I think that's the whole point of retirement.
Boy, I feel like we could have spent the entire episode just on those. So that's fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Roger. One more quick question before we go our separate ways. Roger, what does it mean to you to be a long-term investor?
I think of investment well beyond money. The point of being a long-term investor is to skim off excess capital, whether it's personal capital or financial capital, and put that money to use so I have availability to use it for something at a later point in life. I think of everybody as their own community, right? Peter is Peter, but Peter is also Peter tomorrow and Peter 10 years from now. And when you're a long-term investor, you're investing for those future versions of Peter to help make sure that Peter is okay. Not just okay, but thriving. That's the point of being a long-term investor.
Great stuff as always, Roger. And I'll be sure to link your book, your podcast, the Rock Retirement Club, all in the show notes. Where else can people find you? You're everywhere.
Really, the podcast, rogerwhitney.com. That's the best place to find me.
Okay, well, again, Roger, I really appreciate you being here with me today. And for all those of you watching us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe. If you're listening to us on a podcast, you can subscribe on any podcast platform. If you can leave a review, love seeing the reviews because that influences the type of guests that we have on in the future and the topics we cover. But until next time, thanks for joining us and to long-term investing.
Thanks for listening to the Long-Term Investor Podcast. To access free financial resources and submit questions to be answered on the show, visit thelongterminvestor.com. Peter Lazaroff is an employee of PlanCorp and BrightPlan. All opinions expressed by Peter and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of PlanCorp or BrightPlan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of PlanCorp and BrightPlan may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.